Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle Teo, and I'm the Executive Director at the Middle East Institute. Let me welcome you on behalf of MEI and Abba Eban Institute at the Interdisciplinary Center Herzliya to our event today. Collaborating with partners across the globe and building networks of research, discussion, and shared ideas is very much MEI's goal this year. 2020 may have had its challenges, but it opened the way for us to speak more to academics and like-minded research institutes across the globe, and AEI was one of them. Today's discussions, carried across the Zoom platform and very much dependent on technology, ties in well with our theme of navigating the technological superpower competition. For countries like Singapore and Israel, where innovation is key to our staying ahead of the curve, navigating the competition becomes imperative. I expect a lively time this afternoon as we challenge, discuss, and agree to disagree on a topic that none of us can afford to ignore. Let me now introduce MEI's Chairman Bilahari Kausikan and AEI's Chairman Ron Prosser, both seasoned diplomats from small states surrounded by larger neighbors. I would add that Bilahari and Ron are also old friends, as Singapore and Israel have been
Jesus,
since
Cass, that's
Singapore's
what you need me for. I'm in a
independence.
meeting. Hold on a sec. Um,
Navigating an international arena where national interests inevitably come into play as countries jostle for space, a voice, and influence is nothing new to either of them. And I cannot think of two better individuals to open our event today. Join me, therefore, in first welcoming Bilahari Kausikan and then Ron Prosser.
Oh,
Bilahari.
thanks, Michelle. Good afternoon, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to speak to this webinar jointly organized by the Middle East Institute of the National University of Singapore and the Abba Eban Institute in Israel. And the pleasure is even greater because the Abba Eban Institute is headed by my old friend, Rod Prosser, who was once my counterpart in the Israeli Foreign Ministry and stole quite a number of horses with me. Anyway, let me get straight to the point. I want in this opening remarks to set some context for your discussions. Since nobody has logged on to listen to me, I will be brief. I have 3 points. First, it is abundantly clear that the Biden administration is not going to fundamentally change the Trump administration's approach towards China. What we can expect is that the process by which policies are made and communicated will be more orderly, but there will be no basic change in the trajectory of US-China relations. The reasons for this are obvious but bear recapitulation. There is a bipartisan consensus in the US on being tough with China. To advance his domestic agenda, and his domestic agenda is his priority, Mr. Biden needs Republican support, and his margins in both Senate and House are paper thin. He's not going to rock the boat on China, and in any case, I don't think he wants to shift course on China, even if he could. Neither does Beijing want to change the trajectory of its relationship with the US. It hopes for a more stable relationship, but that's a different matter. With the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party this year and the crucial 20th Party Congress next year, Beijing does not want to look weak. For China, as much as the US, domestic political considerations are key. So the room for maneuver for third countries like Israel and Singapore is limited. Limited, but there is still room for maneuver. No country is ever entirely without agency, but our maneuver space is not overly large, and we should recognize that. Beyond the American politics of China policy, there is a consensus among all major economies that certain aspects of Chinese behavior are unacceptable. The concerns are not identical, and the intensity with which concerns are held varies, but there is no major economy that is without some degree of concerns, and many of these concerns converge on one aspect or another of technology. This is also to be borne in mind as we try to position ourselves vis-a-vis the US and China. Second, the Biden administration has made clear by word and deed that it wants to work closely with American allies and partners. This is all to the good, but it bears emphasizing that the corollary to this is the expectation that American allies and partners should also work more closely with America. In other words, while Mr. Biden will be more polite about it than Mr. Trump, he is no less transactional in his own way. Expectations of allies and partners are high. A related point is that while the Biden administration is less hostile than the Trump administration towards multilateral institutions and international rules, I don't think anyone should have any illusions that multilateral institutions and international law are only a few among the many tools in the toolkit of American statecraft. They are not the entire toolkit. They will be used or not used as appropriate, and we should not assume that American policymakers will instinctively reach for these particular tools as their first preference. The American attitude towards multilateralism and towards international rules has always been ambivalent across many administrations of both parties for a very long time. Trump was an extreme case of a general tendency. Third, to position ourselves to our best advantage or to minimize disadvantage, we should understand the nature of US-China competition clearly. War is highly improbable because of nuclear deterrence. And I think theories such as the so-called Thucydides trap are just silly. The threat of mutually assured destruction kept the peace between the Soviet Union and the US for 40-odd years. And that's why we call their competition the Cold War. Nuclear deterrence will keep the peace between the US and China. This does not mean that their competition will not be intense and may well spill over into kinetic proxy conflicts as US-Soviet competition did during the Cold War. But US-China competition is not a new Cold War. That is an intellectually lazy trope. The US and the Soviet Union led two separate systems that were connected only at their margins. The primary interest they had in common was to avoid mutual destruction. US-Soviet competition was over which system would prevail and replace the other. By contrast, the US and China are both vital and irreplaceable components of a single global system. In fact, they, together with other major economies such as Japan and Europe, they are the system. US-China competition is not about one system replacing another, but about dominance over a single common system. There are obviously important differences between the US and China, but we should neither exaggerate nor downplay these differences. It has been a very long time since anyone could credibly hope or fear that the communist system would replace the market system. All economies are today mixed economies, distinguished from each other primarily by the different balances between political control or regulation, which comes to much the same thing as political control, and the market. I'm of course setting aside moral differences between China and the US and focusing only on the structure of their economies. Furthermore, and most crucially, the US, China, and all other economies that collectively make up the single global system are bound together by, are enmeshed within a web of supply chains of a scope, density, and complexity never before seen in history. This makes it very improbable that either the US or China will be able to entirely disentangle themselves from this dense and intricate web of supply chains. Complete across-the-board decoupling is as improbable as China creating a complete alternative system, although selective decoupling in specific, mainly technological domains has already occurred. For example, the internet is already largely divided, and the same may occur in 5G or cryptocurrency. But the larger point is that this web of supply chains serves as an instrument of their competition, even as it shapes and conditions their competition, and this is particularly so in some technology domains. And I'll end with an example of this more complex sort of competition. We all know that the semiconductor supply chain is particularly intricate, and it is a very serious Chinese vulnerability because all the most crucial nodes in the semiconductor supply chain are held by the US or its allies. But China is 40% of the global semiconductor market. You cannot completely cut out the companies of your allies or your own companies from 40% of the market without fatally hurting those companies and yourself. Among US allies, the geopolitical stakes in Taiwan and South Korea have been enhanced because of their particular importance in semiconductor supply chains. But while Taiwan and South Korea are almost totally dependent on the US for their security, they are also the most exposed and vulnerable of US allies and partners. Now, how all these complexities will work out is anyone's guess. But I do not think we should be daunted by complexity, because in complexity is the promise of greater agency, if only we have the wit to recognize the opportunities and the courage to use them. And I'll now shut up and let you all get on with your discussions. Thank you for listening to me.
Okay, let me hand over to Ron. It's always enjoyable to hear from him. So Ron, you have the floor.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, my good friend Bilahari. I'm really, in the sense, it's always you always challenge me, because after you speak, I have to, be on the front line. So you started by saying the U.S. is not going to change most of its policies on China. Well, in the Middle East, I can tell you that I think everything is changing, and it's really something that we see that comes from an ideology and a feeling that this administration is taking the big aircraft carrier called the United States of America and shifting it towards Iran. And when I take Israel and Singapore, we have to navigate like two small speedboats between a couple of aircraft carriers. I would have said the American aircraft carrier and the Chinese aircraft carrier, because the Chinese don't have an aircraft carrier yet. I have to find another analogy, but the idea is how small countries, and Bilal, you put it very well, we have to see how we can really influence what's happening in our region, because we all, and I think it's very natural, think, and I think rightly so, that we understand our neighborhood and the delicacies better than people looking from the outside. But the point here is that the shift towards Iran has huge effects, because the whole neighborhood is looking. And when I say the whole neighborhood is looking, it means that the neighborhood is basically saying to itself, just a second, we have to live in this area. We have to live in this neighborhood. And if there's a shift, we have to make sure we get our vital interests, national security interests, covered. So you see trends now of the Saudis beginning a serious dialogue with the Iranians. Not surprising. You see Israel, in the sense, making a clear message, sometimes too clear. I think small countries have to be ambiguous in the way they operate. I think it gives them an edge, but also giving a clear message. Okay, you're the United States of America, you're our biggest ally, but on things that pertain to Israel's national security interests, we are not going to be part of this agreement, so don't expect us to play ball all the time on things that we see as very vital for us. Now, we also have the Abraham Accords, which were paradigm shift. Now, when you look at the Abraham Accord and you try and think long term, you basically see that this is very, very sensitive, because the countries that did the move towards Israel, the Gulfies, and you see the amazing cooperation between Israel and the Gulfies and the Saudis under the radar screen, especially with the Saudis, you understand that they have shifted in understanding that Israel is part of the solution, not part of the problem. And the minute they internalize this, the whole posture changes. But there's a big difference. We've seen a lot being done under the radar screen for many years. Very few went above the radar screen and did the outing. What happens when now there's a crisis? Will they go back? Do they feel that the United States of America under this new administration basically is going to give them aerial cover in parentheses to move forward, other countries to join. I don't think that's a message that comes out from Washington at this stage. We saw something, and I want to connect to what Bilhari said on the decision of the F-35s. I have to say that I'm saying it not in hindsight. When the decision was made to reassess, I went publicly and I wrote about this, and I said the US is going to, at the end of the day, agree to the F-35s for one reason, and mainly one reason. Lockheed Martin's factories are both in California and in Georgia. Surprise, surprise, those are democratic states, working places. So leave the politics aside. I'm connecting to what Bilhari talked about, both in the House and in the Senate. Clearly something that this administration is focusing on. When I talk about navigating, Israel and Singapore, you guys will talk, but Israel has to navigate between the United States and China. And where does this navigation really stop? It stops when decisions have to be made in what direction we are going. Okay, so on certain issues like cyber, the point is very, very clear. Israel will not. But we have, as small states, to do as much as we can to defer from reaching the point of decision. Hence, it's a Western way of thinking that basically looks for results, basically says there has to be a solution and we have to make decisions. Why? Not necessarily. Sometimes it's in our national interest not to reach the point of decision because it allows us flexibility. And it's crucial for a country like Israel, a small country, to navigate between two superpowers in the sense where it's very clear that if you push Israel, Israel has one clear and trusted ally, and that's the United States of America. But when we see China here, and we see China in this region, not just with soft power, not just with COVID, not just on the numbers and the statistics on what happens in imports and exports from the Gulf to China. And we see the Chinese also now, I mean, it was a bit exaggerated on the 25-year contract with the Iranians, because the Chinese, in the sense, have a lot of interest in the Gulf with the Saudis and others. But the point here is, the message to the US is, okay, sanctions, not sanctions. You have to understand that we as China are opening up towards Iran, and you won't be able to really control that. We see in our region something that is important, that if there's a rift between the US and Russia, it has huge effects on us, and especially on the issue, on the Iranian issue. Why am I saying that? You need Russia in order to deal with the spent fuel out of Iran. You can't have Russia. I mean, Russia, there's no free lunches here. So in the sense, the Russians won't move, or if you don't cooperate with them. It doesn't look like it's going in that direction in the Russian-American relations. And we are, in the sense, in the middle, and we have to also, and it's a point that is really crucial that I don't think people have thought about it, and I want to raise it here. The problem is with agreements, written agreements. We were used in the past when, focused on the United States of America, when a president decided something, then the commitment stood clear. We see differences now where American commitments on the international agreements are basically changing. And there's no guarantee anymore that those international agreements will be honored. I want to take you to Obama basically abandoning the European interceptor. You remember site EIC the missile defense complex in Poland, basically leaving the Poles and the Czechs in the cold. The whole policy towards Cuba, look at the shift from Obama to Trump, and who knows what's going to happen with Biden. You see the US returning to negotiations table with Iran. So you sign an agreement, you come out of agreement, you go back to an agreement. The F-35s that I mentioned, the official declarations that from an Israeli angle are super important of George Bush after the disengagement with Ariel Sharon on recognizing that in light of the realities on the ground, it is unrealistic of Israel to return to the 1967 lines. That doesn't, you pay basically in cash on guarantees. So in the sense, we as small states have to understand that yes, we have allies, but we also have to be able to understand that we have to take care of ourselves and rely on ourselves on issues that pertain to our national security. Now, all this is happening, on the backdrop of an intensive competition for technological superiority. And, we in Israel are always ready to talk about qualitative military edge. But I think we're beginning to hear from our allies, the US, QT, qualitative technological edge. What do you guys think in Israel? That if someone comes over to Palo Alto and we tell him go home, he can come to Herzliya and get what he wants. Well, surprise, surprise, guys, you have to recalibrate. So in the sense, I think that small countries, and we are small, but I think we are very effective. We have to find ways, and Bilal mentioned it, don't want to belabor on the issue of technological edge, both on the microchip issues, the countries that are producing them. And in essence, we have to be able to navigate in a way that will allow us to have our country benefit from, I take China and the US in the region, understanding the huge, huge potential of China. And in addition, when I talk about Israel, and there's a discrepancy here, the feeling in China, they don't have a baggage like the Europeans have towards Israel or Jews. On the contrary, it's a positive attitude. And we have to find ways in order to basically continue this relationship, which is strategically important for us. Last but not least, to give you an example of what I'm saying on using opportunities, the United Kingdom, and Simon, the United Kingdom after Brexit can sign agreements. They're not bound by the EU anymore. We are compatible on certain areas very relevant to the United Kingdom. This is something we should push forward as a small country, understanding the opportunities that are there in the world. So my point here is, in Germans, they would say klein aber fein. So we are small but fine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ron. That was very interesting. Let me now hand over to Gore, who will take over the next segment of this event. Thank you very much, Ron, and Gore, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and thank you, and many thanks to our two chairmen for their opening remarks. I'm Dalia Afterman, and I'm the new executive director of the Abba Eban Institute, and I'm looking forward for further discussions and cooperation with Michelle and our friends from Singapore. For the remaining of the discussion, I'll be playing your host, moderating the discussion, which is jointly designed by our team members from both institutions. Just before we continue, I'd like to say that the subject of today's discussion, navigating the technological superpower competition, will surely resonate not only with those in political and computer sciences, but it will make a lot of sense also to those who work on and serve in areas of defense and national security. I can testify so myself, having just recently completed a period of about 8 years in the IDF Operations Directorate as head of strategic wargaming. Now, the combination of advanced technologies of all sorts, together with the so-called great power competition, as mostly referred to in the American parley, is much debated issue in halls of political power and military command. But nonetheless, it's still it still possesses or still has a lot of ambiguity into it, and even an air of mystery, and to be honest, sometimes even an embarrassment in view of this uncharted territory that we would like to, and the complexity that we would like to unlock today. So I'm confident enough to assure all our speakers and participants how relevant is the discussion of today, and how persistent is the need to unlock that complexity that also Ambassador Bilhari referred to, that our subject presents today. And hopefully, by the end of today's proceedings, we'll be able to draw some practical conclusions for national security, diplomacy, and perhaps even more ambitiously for our nation's respective grand strategies. So we've heard the two opening remarks by Ambassador Bilhari and Ambassador Poussol that help us to frame the discussion, and we should now dive deeper further into this subject. And our keynote speaker is Professor Simon Chesterman, the Dean of the Law Faculty at the National University of Singapore. As a leading academic with a vast body of scholarly work, Professor Chesterman is well positioned to guide us through a subject that up until a few years ago might otherwise have sounded as if taken from science fiction films. But today, with less fiction and much more science, we need to address questions on artificial intelligence, personhood, robotics, and their legal status. So Professor Simon Chesterman, up to 15 minutes. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to join this distinguished group, and I will try to be within 15 minutes. And if it looks like I'm going to go beyond that, please just cut me off. I'm a ruthless chair myself, and I respect ruthless chairs. But maybe before I get into the meat, I do want to connect what I'm going to say to the opening remarks by Bilahari and Ron. And I say this as an Australian who 20 years ago was living in New York around the time that the EP3 spy plane incident happened, which was 20 years ago this month. And many of you will remember that. Some of you might not remember it, you might be too young. But around the start of the George W. Bush administration, there was discussion about whether, as Bilahari, I think quite rightly, dismissed the idea of containing China today, there was serious discussion about containing China 20 years ago. And the EP3 spy plane incident became a focal point. There was serious discussion about a new Cold War. And then, of course, September 11, 2001 happened. And I say that because it's relevant not only because of an anniversary, but because of the impact it had on small states. And I'll include Australia as a maybe small to medium-sized state. But back 20 years ago, certainly for Singapore and Australia, if forced to choose between their political security ties to the United States and their economic interests in China, the choice would have been very clear. Both would have gone with the United States. They would have preferred not to have to choose, but if push, would have gone with the United States. Today, we really hope we're not forced to choose. And it would be much harder, certainly under Trump, but even under Biden. So that's one point of connection. And then on this question of technological opportunity, and I think both Israel and Singapore are poised to take advantage of the opportunities of the digital revolution, we nonetheless confront a challenge, which is that both countries are essentially rule takers, that this space is dominated by major players. The European Union, outside its economic clout and certainly its technological clout, has played a major role in setting global norms for want of any competition. So in areas like data protection and now regulation of artificial intelligence, one of the most important players is the European Union in a regulatory sense, while in a capacity sense, in technological advancements, it's really the United States and China that play the key role, but both adopting very different approaches. The US, in contradistinction to the European human rights-led approach, America is very much market dominated, with technological companies leading the way. Whereas for China, it's very much a state interest or a sovereignty model, where, as we heard Bilahari sort of touched on, the idea of a fragmented internet, data localization provisions that China imposes on its own population and people resident within China do run the risk of a bifurcated internet, which would undermine much of the opportunity for globalization and integration that was precisely the point of the information superhighway. So what I'm going to be talking about now in the approximately 13 minutes, I think maybe 11 minutes that I've got left, is a kind of projection forward, some of the legal issues that we might confront today, but may certainly have to confront in the future. And just to liven it up, I'm going to include some slides. If you are very keen, there's an article that's based on this, that this presentation is based on, but I'll go through it pretty quickly to give you a sense of some of the possibilities in this area. And I'll start with just a framing device, which is that later this year, I think in June, in Britain, the £50 note will be the last of the British currency to go plastic. And so 2 years ago, there was a competition. Who should be on the face of this note? Astonishing, the result was not Poundy McPoundface, which is what I thought would happen. Rather, it was Alan Turing. So Turing is famous, of course, for his role in computer science, the manner and circumstances of his death, but probably in the popular imagination, he's best known for the test that bears his name as to whether a computer is truly intelligent. This was based on a 1950s game called the Imitation Game, where a man and a woman would be in a separate room, and those in the first room would have to try and guess whether certain messages were being sent by a man or a woman. And Turing posited that if you replaced one of these with a machine, we might plausibly say machines were intelligent when we couldn't tell the difference, when we couldn't tell whether it was a machine or a person answering. Now, there were some efforts to try and pursue this. One of the most prominent were list processing language programs like ELIZA, which pretended to be a therapist. And essentially, this was a pretty simple program that would just reformulate questions, send them back to you. So when the person says, my boyfriend made me come here, ELIZA says, is it important to you that your boyfriend made you come here? If ELIZA doesn't understand, then it would just ask another, a pretty general question like, what's the connection, do you suppose? So these days, computer scientists don't take these tests pretty seriously. And indeed, as a measure of whether machines are in fact intelligent, the Turing test has pretty much fallen from favor, at least in computer science. But I'm raising it as a question because one of the challenges moving forward as machines become faster, more autonomous, more opaque, we're going to have to work out who is responsible for the decisions that they take and whether there is indeed an argument that at some point in the future they might in fact deserve personality. So why are we asking all these questions? At least why are lawyers like me asking these questions? Well, the first and most prominent reason is so that there's someone to blame when things go wrong. So this is yesterday's Guardian newspaper. I assume this was news in Israel as well. We had another autonomous vehicle kill its passengers. Now, more than 1 million people die in traffic accidents every year, the vast majority because of human error. But we get a disproportionate interest on the part of the public when it's an autonomous vehicle that crashes, because there is this fear, this concern, who is responsible? So that's one reason we might want to have legal personality for artificial intelligence systems. So we've got someone to blame. But a second reason we might want to think about that is so that we've got someone to reward. AI systems increasingly produce art, they generate value, they're arguably creating patentable inventions. Who should own these products if the AI system goes far beyond the capacities of the human programmer? So these are two reasons why we might want to think about legal personality. Someone to blame when things go wrong, someone to reward when things go right. But a third possibility will arise shortly. All of this used to be theoretical. Then this is Sophia in 2017, Saudi Arabia granted Sophia citizenship, quote unquote citizenship. Now, this is a bit of a gimmick. Sophia is essentially a chatbot with a face, but it led some people to take more seriously the idea of legal personality for AI systems. In the same year, the European Parliament said that maybe legal status might be necessary so that you can blame them, again, when they go wrong, or when they're making autonomous decisions or interacting with people. So these two reasons, someone to blame, someone to reward, broadly reflect two traditional ideas of legal personality. So someone to blame when things go wrong, that's an instrumental reason, and that's the reason we give legal personality to corporations and other what are called juridical persons. In terms of someone to reward, that's really recognizing that we tend to value human life in all its forms, and you don't have to sort of prove, you don't have to go through a Turing test to prove that you're a human. The mere fact of being a human gives you plenary rights under most legal systems. It wasn't always the case. We used to have slaves. In some jurisdictions, women are still treated as inferior citizens. Many jurisdictions, there are limits on the rights of children, but broadly, humans are treated equally, or at least should be, around the world. There is, however, a third reason we might want to start thinking about legal personality, and that's in the event that machines ever become sufficiently real that they take it upon themselves to assert legal personality, the kind of Blade Runner scenario here. And so one reason we might want to think about legal personality is to shape or constrain behavior in the event that a superintelligence emerges. And as the chair said, this is at the moment confined to the fringes of science fiction. But one of the misconceptions many people have about AI, what's called the Android Fallacy, is the idea that if AI ever really emerges, it will be human level and operating in sort of humanoid form. And there are many science fiction authors who are to blame for this. But the reality is, if we ever get to the point where an AI system is as intelligent as, say, a dog or a dolphin, it's not going to go from there to low-level intelligent human and then slowly make its way up towards Einstein or someone else. Once it gets to that point, there is a real danger of an explosion and an AI system that is vastly more intelligent and potentially vastly more powerful than us. So the paper goes through this in detail. I don't propose to. There's natural and juridical persons. Natural persons, we're given rights. Many jurisdictions have various formulations of endowed by their creator. Juridical persons, we have corporations. It's not only corporations. We also have religious organizations are often given personality. In New Zealand, there's a river. The entire ecosystem of Ecuador was given legal personality. And a lot of this is really a gimmick to get around standing requirements to give individuals the rights to act and to protect those institutions. But one of the vehicles, one of the reasons why instrumental personality might be a reason is that it could give us a means of addressing that accountability deficit people worry about. In the event that an autonomous vehicle crashes, who should we sue? Who should pay? Or if something goes wrong, who can we blame? And so there's various discussions about the possibility of pursuing that in a legal context. The short answer I'll give you is I don't think any of these hold water. I don't think any of this is necessary in order to address alleged liability gaps. Put simply, what happens in the case of autonomous vehicles, for example, at the moment, if I crash into you because I'm driving negligently, you can sue me. If I injure you because my car blows up, you might be able to sue the manufacturer. As cars become more autonomous, what we're essentially going to see is a shift from the first situation to the second. And eventually cars might not have steering wheels at all, in which case we'll essentially be moving from driver liability to product liability. None of this is particularly new in law. It's a little bit more complex in the area of criminal law, and there tends to be a bit of an obsession on the part of some theorists writing about robot punishment and the idea of decommissioning or destroying robots. But again, I don't think any of this really holds water. And if people are particularly interested, you can read the article. I'll put a link in the chat, or we can talk about it in conversation. But the second reason why we might want to think about legal personality is whether AI systems are it's not merely useful to hold them to account. There might be an argument that they should actually be entitled to something because of what they can do. I've already mentioned the Android fallacy. The problem with this kind of approach is that it hasn't worked in the past. There have been various efforts to recognize the rights of non-person entities that demonstrate moral sensibility, capacity similar to humans. And some ethicists have gone so far as to say that the moral worth of a chimpanzee might be greater than a severely brain-damaged human or even an infant human. But none of these have really been embraced in legal systems around the world. The conclusion at the end of a whole series of lawsuits in the United States on this question was that it might be arguable that a chimpanzee is not a person. The hope was that we could at least recognize that it was more than merely a thing, a point I'll come back to towards the end. What we're really looking at here is what machines are versus what they can do. And one of the reasons why this has become an issue in legal circles is machine-assisted creation. Now, there's a long history of this. Indeed, for a long time, it wasn't recognized that photography was a meaningful art form. All you're doing is pressing a button. And it took this photo of Oscar Wilde going all the way up to the US Supreme Court before photography was recognized as a creative art. Jump forward to today, many of you will have seen this, the world's most famous selfie. There was a pretty rich argument about whether a photographer could claim credit for a photo that was taken by a macaque. In the end, the law was upheld, traditional law. The photographer won his case, but he agreed to donate some of the proceeds, I think about 25% of the royalties, to preserving crested macaques. This was pretty much across the board the position until we had a case in China about a year and a half ago, where Dreamwriter was recognized as the owner of essentially recognized as the owner of an article that it had automatically written. This is a machine created by Tencent, and it was found that its copyright had been infringed. So there is a move here in terms of recognizing the creation of non-human entities as something attributable to a non-human entity, but we haven't quite gone so far as to formally recognize that yet. The last reason we might want to at least think about this is that if AI ever reaches human intelligence, it won't stop there. And so again, in the paper, I talk about different reasons we might want to think about this. The AI takeover is the extreme case, but there are real dangers of misalignment of values where a machine, for example, is taught to play chess or make paper clips. And if that instruction is not given carefully and the machine is all powerful, it might interpret its instruction in that the primary obstacle to it either winning chess or making paper clips is the prospect that it could one day be turned off. And so its first motivation would be to try and make sure that that never happens. How do we stop this? One method would be to control AI to try and ensure that there is an off switch. But an alternative approach is actually to think about whether there are ways in which we can align its values with ours. I won't go into Asimov in this context, but if you did embed an AI system within a legal system, endow it with rights and obligations, there is at least a semi-serious argument that this might be part of creating within it a reflective equilibrium that could align its values with humanity's. And I mentioned the position of slaves and women in the past. One reason for hope here is that almost all legal systems, as they have expanded the notion of legal personality, it's tended to continue expanding rather than to contract. And so there are two possible outcomes. Either we might be included within that expansion if AI ever does surpass us, or at least like the chimpanzees in those New York cases I touched on, it might not regard us as equals, but at least regard us as more than things. So the conclusion is, and the short answer certainly today, should we give AI legal personality? No. It's too simple and it's too complex. It's too simplistic an answer to the complex problem of AI systems. There's no meaningful category of AI that we could attribute personality to. It's also overly complex in that it assumes various moves in the direction of that sort of science fiction scenario that we are not near yet. It bears thinking about, it bears preparation for, but at the moment, I don't think it's necessary. And I'll conclude, this is Mr. Turing himself coming to life with the founder of much of what is today computer science. But again, my conclusion would be we're not yet at the point of needing to recognize robot rights, but if we ever do, the question might not be so much whether we recognize their rights as whether they recognize ours. So this is a shameless plug for a forthcoming book, but I'll stop there and hopefully I'm not too far out of time.
Thank you very much, Professor Chesterman. It's a fascinating presentation that raises a lot of critical questions, not only in the legal sphere, but also in our human existence and also in the security and even military context as well. We will now move to our panel presentations, but before diving into that section, please allow me to state a few house rules that will make this part of the discussion smooth and effective. In order to avoid unnecessary background noises, may I ask that only those receiving the floor later on will keep their microphones open. The rest should remain on mute mode. All speakers are kindly asked to keep their presentations in line with the time allocated to them. And if you wish to present a question to our panelists later on, please raise your virtual hand on Zoom, and you will be perhaps given the floor later on to present your short question and not a long statement, obviously. Lastly, for the sake of convenience and the flow of the discussion, the summaries of our speakers' biographies can be found in the briefing paper sent to you all earlier. Three colleagues will present their work, expanding on the issues discussed thus far with supplementary perspectives and raising further questions to address. Hopefully, by the end of it, we'll have the answers that we're looking for. Our first panelist is Dr. Dalia Afterman, the head of the Asia Policy Program at the Abba Eban Institute. With a rather unusual Australian-Israeli background, he takes a particular interest in Asian regional security and Chinese foreign policy. He will discuss the role of small states in the era of AI. Dalia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gur. First, allow me to add my own words of appreciations and thanks to our Singaporean partners, Ambassador Bilhari, Michelle, Alex, and the rest of the team. This event is part of an already important cooperation between our institutions, which I believe is only becoming more important. So to start, we all understand that the competition between the United States is becoming increasingly focused on technology and innovation, from 5G to 6G to semiconductors to health tech and AI, and more broadly to setting global standards for the internet and beyond. It seems that both superpowers have reached the conclusion that technological supremacy will play a decisive role in determining the outcome of the superpower race. Chinese initiatives such as Made in China 2025 and China Standards 2035 aim both to upgrade China's domestic technological capabilities and to position it as a global leader and standard setter in these areas. The United States under Biden aims to contain China's technological ascent while building its own technological leadership. Despite a shift in tone in many areas by the Biden administration, we see that on China, and particularly on technology, the current administration is containing Trump's line, but is taking a more systematic approach. Technology and innovation are now seen as strategic assets to be shared with allies and blocked from rivals. This new reality is placing many smaller countries in a new and unfamiliar position, having to navigate and promote their own interest while balancing the demands of the two competing superpowers. In my following remarks, I will try to describe some of the challenges and, as Ambassador Bilhari said, perhaps opportunities that middle powers face in the current dynamics. To open, I should note that, yes, the superpower competition is indeed intensifying, but there's no clear winner yet in this competition. This makes the role of middle powers very, very important. Both superpowers rely on middle powers to help give them an advantage in critical areas. As doors are closing for Chinese companies in the United States, many are moving their financial hubs to Singapore to give them more flexibility, both in the region and globally. Israel, the startup nation for its part, is seen as an innovation powerhouse with cyber and other technology capabilities sought after by both superpowers. China has identified Israel in particular as a potential partner in its quest for technological self-reliance. We all remember that as the trade war between the United States and China was warming up in late 2018, Chinese Vice President Wang Qishan led the Chinese delegation to the Innovation Summit in Israel, which he headed together with Prime Minister Netanyahu. This was a very clear message to the Chinese investors that Israel is a strategic source for innovation and technology. And indeed, 2018 was a record year for Chinese investment in Israeli high-tech. But of course, this did not go unnoticed by Washington. Pressure is now growing on Israel to regulate and limit its engagement with China on key technological issues. Dual-use technologies in particular are seen as decisive in the superpower competition, but the challenge is how do we classify such technologies? We can find them anywhere in anything from microchips to autonomous driving systems to healthcare and other areas. More broadly, we're also seeing attempts by the superpowers to regulate the internet and other technological uses. These kind of protocols will shape our internet privacy and experience for years to come. As we know, the tech competition first reached a peak when the United States sought to counter China's technological advantage in 5G. The United States later launched a campaign with its allies, with partial or relative success with its allies in the West. But in places like the Middle East and Africa, we are seeing that China is moving forward and is becoming a dominant technological force. And we will hear more about this in the next presentation. Over the last few days, we've heard about the joint effort by US and Japan to jointly develop the 6G network, with the express intention to cooperate with third countries to gain dominance for future applications, services, and data. As mentioned earlier, much attention is given recently to sanctions imposed by the United States on semiconductors. This is an area that's dominated by the United States, but also by smaller countries such as Taiwan and the Netherlands. COVID-19 has led to a growth in demand and to a global shortage in this area. And we see leading companies like Taiwan's TSMC struggling to meet demand, but also keep market access both to China and to other areas. Israel too can find itself in a tricky position on semiconductors. Already a substantial portion of its trade with China is based on Intel microchips developed in Israel. And recently global companies such as Google and Microsoft have announced new Israel-based microchip programs. So taking all this into account, this whole situation, what insights can we gain for smaller countries? The first I would say is that technological and economic decoupling are not good for small and middle countries. Middle countries must work to avoid choosing sides. Middle countries should actually work to avoid being in a position of needing to make a choice. Instead, they should work together to reinforce the open globalized system, to create new avenues and frameworks for cooperation among themselves, and including other important powers such as India, Japan, and South Korea. If it's necessary to fall on one side of the fence, the way the decision is implemented and communicated is not less important than the decision itself. And we should say that over the last few years, we've seen a few different models, a few different examples of the way middle powers and the way respond and react to superpower competition. For example, we've seen Australia choose sides very quickly on the superpower competition, choose sides very clearly, and suffer economic sanctions from China. On the other hand, we have New Zealand, also a member of the Five Eyes, that followed many of the same decisions, but in a much more low-key way. But in turn, it has expanded recently its FTA with China. Singapore has also demonstrated its own skills in managing superpower tensions in the savvy way that it handled the 5G issue, for example. Finally, and this connects me to what Ambassador Bilhari said earlier, it's important to keep in mind that the current state of superpower competition can also create opportunities for middle countries to renegotiate their positions vis-a-vis the superpowers. What do they get in return for deciding one way or another? What can the superpowers give in return for small powers' support or lack of support for the other side? I think these are some of the issues that we should keep in mind moving forward. I'll end here, but I'll be very happy to continue in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dalia. Thank you very much. And we now move to our second panelist, Dr. Alessandro Arduino, and I hope I pronounced his surname correctly, the Principal Research Fellow at the Middle East Institute of Singapore. While preparing for today's meeting, I was very happy to learn that Alex and I share some King's College affiliation together, and one must also recognize that among his many achievements, he has been appointed Knight of the Order of the Italian Star by the President of the Republic, which in British terms, British equivalent terms, should have made us all address him as Sir Alex. So, Sir Alex, I give the floor to you. 10 minutes.
Very much, Gur. I'm still waiting from the horse, but knighthood has been okay up to now. Having said that, I'm extremely pleased to be here today, and I have to thank you, our colleague from Abba Eban Institute, for all the work that we have been doing together during this year. Basically, in my very short presentation, I want to make 3 points. 1, what is the digital Silk Road? 2, how the country from the Middle East to East Asia are looking to balance Chinese digital ecosystem with United States security necessity, and then what we are going to look in the near future. So as Dalia just mentioned, the global trade, and we are used to that, become hostages of the confrontation, the friction between United States and China. I don't like, as a security practitioner, to use the term war, even if it's a trade war, because I find it quite wrong. Having said that, what is the digital Silk Road? Basically, in the common imagination, is just the 5G component of the Belt and Road Initiative. That's not the case. Digital Silk Road overlap with China Belt and Road Initiative, but it differentiated to the fact that mostly are Chinese private company that operate in the technology field. Of course, we can debate for hours, day or month, when the public hand finish and the private one start in China. But again, if you see just the $28 million slapped on Alibaba recently, can tell a different story about digital Silk Road. The term itself started to expand in 2015, but it's been defined as a digital Silk Road during the Wuzhen meeting in China in 2017. And quite interesting, one of the few countries that was working all together in framing the digital Silk Road definition was the UAE, the Emirates. 5G is an important component of the digital Silk Road, but just a small fraction of one of the 5 pillars of the digital Silk Road. 5G with satellite connection, Beidou, with fiber optic cables, with big data is a part. The other pillar are e-commerce, e-finance, fintech, smart city, cybersecurity, and especially in the Gulf, for example, the cybersecurity part with Chinese characteristic is quite welcome. And as Professor Chesterman just mentioned, in the race for AI, up to now we are looking at narrow AI that can still give to country, to superpower and hedge, military hedge, financial hedge, geopolitical hedge, big data is at the core. So whoever can grasp more big data for machine learning is going to have an advantage in this AI race. And of course, the expansion of the digital Silk Road from Middle East to East Asia is going to give to China quite important advantage. So in my second point is how Middle East country and East Asia are going to have a balancing act. As Ambassador Prosor just mentioned, not making a strategic decision is a strategic decision itself. And it's quite important, is how basically up to now, country from the Gulf to Indonesia and to Singapore are not quite keen in choosing a side. Of course, US, if we look just for example at the few days of the last term of Mr. Pompeo time during the Trump administration was pushing the Clear Network Initiative, asking to all ally and friend country to purge Chinese system, Chinese equipment, Chinese app. But quite interesting, if you compare East Asia with Middle East, you have some similarities. UAE, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, they are trying to differentiate their economy. And digitalization is at the key of this differentiation. 2013 vision, digital, smart city, it's a core part of Middle East country in the Gulf to change from oil-oriented economy to the new economy. If you look at Indonesia, for example, there is this ambition to become the biggest e-market for all East Asia. But then if you have a comparison and you look at other two countries in these two parts, in these two different regions, one is Israel and one is South Korea. In Israel, China is not looking to sell. In Israel, China is looking basically to acquire technology. But then Israel needs to balance this economic entanglement with China, with, of course, with the security necessity within the United States. Similar South Korea. Again, it's a small country, but is a technological giant. Samsung is one of the biggest supplier of microchip to China. But at the same time, the necessity, security necessity are very clear in South Korea and where South Korea stands with the USA. Of course, there are countries in the Middle East who don't need this kind of balancing act, and I'm referring to Iran, that is linked directly to the Chinese ecosystem, and there is not much chance to have different decision. But then again, if we look exactly where in AI race, in technology race, in navigating between these two superpower technology ecosystem, where really the rubber meets the road is the smart city. Developing a smart city require integration of sensor, big data, analytical software, AI, that China is at the moment giving at competitive price. But at the same time, if we look, for example, at connection, US just established a project to connect Indonesia with fiber optic direct to the United States, 16 kilometers of fiber optic line. And then just to shorten my presentation and to don't take much of the time, I basically wanted to cancel my last statement. I wanted to say, what is the worst case scenario? One country will be in the necessity to choose between two digital ecosystems. The worst case scenario will be a bifurcation. A bifurcation will mean different supply chain, not be able to buy microchip, not be able to have rare earth from one area or the other, but also will be different regulation, different standard. The simple fact that a mobile phone will not be able to connect in a center area. And then what I really wanted to delay from my presentation, and I'm not going to say, is that if we progress in this direction, we are going to witness a rise of a cyber iron curtain. But Chairman Bilahari said that the comparison with Cold War is intellectually lazy. So I'm not going to say that during my presentation, and I will just end with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex. Before we can move to our last panelist, may I remind all our participants, encourage them to think and develop some questions to everybody, and you are encouraged to raise your virtual hand, and we will give you the floor later on. Thank you, Alex. And now we move to our last panelist, but certainly not least, our third and final one, Daniel Cohen, head of the Policy and Technology Program at the Abba Eban Institute. Daniel's research includes cybersecurity, cyber terrorism, with a particular focus on the use of internet and social media by terrorist organizations, influence operations, and counterterrorism. An ex-combat soldier, present rower, and a promising scholar, Daniel has already shown impressive record of success in developing innovative ways to disrupt the malicious activities of some very nasty, bad people. So Daniel, over to you, 10 minutes.
Thanks, Gul. Thanks, everyone. I really enjoyed the discussion so far, especially Alex's last comment that he was supposed to delete regarding the cyber war. So it really relates to my presentation. Let me share the screen for a second. Everybody can see it? Great. So I will actually, if I need to give a title for my presentation, it would be a Superpower Navigating the Big Tech Companies Competition. So it's a bit the opposite in my case. Why we're gonna relate a war against online terrorism to this fruitful and best practices and a really interesting discussion, because I believe that what we see regarding the war against terrorism in near time, it fulfills technology that being used in dual use of technology into civilian aspects and not only military or governmental one. And actually we saw in the last couple of years the war against terrorism on the online side of it as like a playground where we saw the new tools were being used by different countries, superpowers, but also others. And it's really interesting to see in the upcoming years if we will see it more and more. We even saw it as an example in the war against COVID, and especially emphasis on AI. for example, and also the use of big data for monitoring, reporting, and detecting terrorism or pandemic issues. So first of all, I will divide my speak between the public space and the private space. I will only show examples from the public space or from the open source. Actually, we are heavily invested in research, what we use it as social media intelligence. What we do in the program, we mainly focus on terror organizations and try to combine between, let's call it a domain expert or country social expertise with data science and integrate it with social network analytics. Our approach is a top-down and bottom-up. We're trying to use it for evidence-based research on open source and to find evidence regarding terror activity, but also to get insights and trends by doing so when we look at it from a bottom-up approach. Now, my first observation would be that when we speak about the online war against terrorism, social media is not a substitute to understand the basic motives of terrorists, but it plays a critical role in shaping the identity and perceptions of many of the terrorist attacks that we saw in the last couple of years. And it goes much beyond the scope of online incitement. We see also a lot of many common dominators and patterns. For example, preparation to attacks using social media to send farewell. We saw it in Israel, and I will provide more details on that soon in my presentation. And in generally, social media and instant messaging platforms offer interaction and engagement, and they are actually enablers of influence without any centralized leadership or organizational infrastructure. And we see it on an unprecedented scale. Many of that is because unique architecture of social media. But on the other hand, we do see some of it being centralized. We see hubs around influencers, recruiters, theological figures like clerics and others. And we also see, especially in the Israeli case, but also in the war against ISIS in the last couple of years, circles of empowerment when someone commits an attack, and then we see copycats that join in after him and will follow him on the social media. So I will say it's like a mix between a centralized approach and a decentralized approach. But to sum it up, the web offers alternative sources of legitimacy, of traditional sources of authority, and plays a key role in the dynamic process of radicalization. Now, I won't show today any of radicalization process, not in Southeast Asia, not in Israel, not in the Middle East, but I can tell you for sure that in our research, we see it, and we can see it by time, the progress of it when we look back, present, and try to predict maybe for the future using AI. Now, as I said, I will use a couple of showcases where we see different strategies, tactics, and methods by different countries related to Israel, Southeast Asia, but also to superpowers, in this case, the United States war against ISIS. And I will start with the wave of terrorism in Israel between 2015 and 2017. Many stabbings on the street, ramming, less using of suicide bombers as we saw in the past. But when we analyze the terrorist attack characters, we see many common dominators between many of the attackers. So many of them were young, single, not affiliated with any established terrorist organization, not with the Hamas or Jihadist Islamic movement. And actually, most of them didn't have any previous terror activity background. So we can see it as a decentralized network. In a broader observation, if we don't see any political or organizational framework behind it, meaning that the motivation in many of the cases is maybe a bit different from only looking at it as an ideological motivation to commit an attack. But one thing that jumped out, and again, when you look on young people, Many of them were under 18 even, some of them were even 15 and less, but the average was around 18. We see inspiration and motivation that came from online incitement on social media platforms. Just one example you can see on the right side, 2 attackers killed 2 Israeli policemen, and you can see them like an hour before the attack, posting on Facebook and saying the smile tomorrow will be much more, will be more beautiful. And you can see that as some kind of a farewell before committing the attack. Now, there was many debates in Israeli scholars, experts, and also, I believe, at least according to foreign media, by a security agency, how to deal with this phenomena. At some point, there was an understanding that, okay, Israel is maybe notorious in using cyber offensive tools, or at least again by foreign media, but in this case, there's nothing that can be done if it's people that live on the online world. So something else needs to be built here, a mechanism that will be able to deal with this kind of phenomena. And then we saw, I believe it was in late 16, the start of the use of big data analytics, but also the use of artificial intelligence to try to understand the patterns and common dominators of potential terrorist attacks. As we know, and we saw, all of us saw it in the Tom Cruise movie, you can't arrest someone for an attack he didn't commit, but from, again, at least from foreign media, they were able to structure lists of potential attackers, and they were received warrants, many of them to the families, to the parents, to do something with the kids. Some of it went into the Palestinian authorities, and they made those calls, and it was able to reduce the number of what was called back then spontaneous or inspiration attacks by people that were living in the friction areas between Jews and Arabs in East Jerusalem or in next to settlements, and that did this kind of spontaneous attack. So we saw here, at least from the Israeli aspect, a first time by the understanding that nothing can be done and you can't shut down Facebook in the territories or in East Jerusalem, and using big data and AI to confront this kind of terror attacks. In a different showcase, the online war against ISIS, we started to see different things. I mainly was researching 2 aspects. One of them was the counter-narrative campaigns by the State Department and their co-partners all across the coalition, if it's in the Middle East or in Europe, and their interaction with civic society. And I will say that they were like working on a war that they can win. The reason is that a terrorist attack, and I'm not trying to show this picture as something that is centralized, but when you have influencer clerks, social media experts that working for a terror organization and produce content each day in dozens of them, if it's videos, banners, posts, and so on, it's really hard to stop it in one place because it will pop in again in other places. Some call it walking the mole. But what we saw is a phenomena of shiftment from traditional social media accounts like Facebook and Twitter that also took part in it using AI, hashing, and so on. And then we saw a move to more encrypted and anonymous platforms like Telegram, for example, and from then trying to pop into Facebook, Twitter, and so on, but also going into more exclusive forums like in the darknet and other anonymous forums that could afford it. So this is not a good start point for counter-narrative campaigns using technology, in this case, technology for marketing. And we saw the State Department building those centers that were trying to fight a network by a network. And I will just go quickly, one of the criticisms that came from the inside, and it was actually leaked into New York Times by a senior deputy at the State Department. saying that it didn't work. It didn't work because we used outside content. It was very slow, centralized, reactive, not coherent, and it was like preaching to the choir. You can't try to fight a network by a network. Maybe it needs to be done by from the inside. And if you want to go into the roots, maybe something else needs to be done here. So then we saw in the end of 16, we saw actually for the first time, because it was becoming operational back then, US Cyber Command starting to use cyber warfare tools to confront this phenomena of ISIS online recruitment. And then we saw them trying to get into the core of the people that were behind the spreading of content by ISIS and recruiting people online. And a couple of things that they did was actually, as I said before, for me, it looks like a playground for using new tools that can be also be part of the superpower cyber war, because we saw pretty much the same modus of operandi by the US Cyber Command against Russian trolls or Russian cyber criminals during the midterms in 2018. So changing password on social media, that was the easy part, but they also deleted Islamic State battlefield videos from the internet. They did it in some way in a collaboration with the tech companies, but sometimes they did it by themselves. They destroyed computer networks, destroyed servers, for example, and spread malware to block jihadist access to data. Also, they fought against fake news and disrupted terrorist cash transactions. Now, it was a joint cooperation not only by the Cyber Command, the GCHQ, Five Eyes were also involved, including Australian government. And very interesting to see this maybe aggressive style of maybe even a Cold War, as Alex mentioned before, and not only the use of more software tools like social media and fighting a network by a network to counter narratives. So to sum up this part, we saw the use of big data and AI in the Israeli war against spontaneous terrorists during 2015-2017. Same time, we saw counter-narratives campaign, mainly by State Department, and also the use, for again, for the first time at least, to the public eyes of the use of cyber warfare against a terror organization. And I would like to sum it up and wrap it up by looking a bit on the jihadist network in Southeast Asia. This is not part of our scope at the Institute, but very interesting findings I think we saw during the years. That many of the words, when we were looking on a jihadist network or terrorist activity, we ended them in Southeast Asia, mainly in places like Indonesia and Malaysia and Philippines. We saw in the last 4 years from ticking bombs to cyber hackers and big data experts. And we also saw many of the radicalization process, because we can see it on Facebook and on Twitter, in a passive way, without doing anything that is not ethical or legally wrong, but only looking on open source intelligence. One example is Jamaah Islamiyah. Of course, we saw Jamaah Islamiyah as a pro-ISIS group in Indonesia being very active in the last year. We saw attacks and arrests from the other side by the police of supporters of them. One of the famous convicted terrorism, actually, clerks that was behind one of the provinces that was leading one of the efforts of Jamaah Islamiyah is bin Sef Fahim. Very easy to see, he's now in jail actually, because he was arrested again last month with 20 of his followers after a series of terror attacks in Indonesia, and there was before and also after. Only we saw it in the last month. 2 suicide bombers that were related not actually to Jamaah Islamiyah, but affiliates of them, Jad. And you can see that the bin Sef Fahim is very active on social media. This, we can see it as a more holistic, centralized way. We see a lot of campaigns for release him, and we can see all of his YouTube videos online. And in a different way to see it, we can see that he has many followers that still continue to spread radicalization online. Of course, I didn't want to show any faces, but again, this is all only using open source and what Facebook provides to us to do so. In the end of the day, what is interesting to understand that a public figure like that has many followers and they have many followers also. It's a global effort because it never ends in one province or one country. And if we take it even further, there will also be links between different kind of systems or networks that have a correlation between them or engagement between them, and will never end in one country or one province. And we will always see a connection to other parts of the world, and even in the neighborhood, like we saw last month, when we saw the indictment and the 3 maids actually from Indonesia that worked in Singapore that were convicted for funding terrorism. And what was interesting there, just to sum it up, that when you read the court, at least what was published on one of the maids, you see that she was getting radicalized on Facebook, online. At some point, she started to go into the more exclusive groups on Telegram. And then she shared this kind of information on Facebook to her followers. And at some point, we got really involved in it and started also to send money and to fund terror activity in Indonesia. So in the end of the day, all of that relates. What I can offer is a response that we were trying to shape at the Institute. We say that there's a need of the government. There's a tools in the private sector, but actually the civil sector or academic world can be some kind of operator and to provide a lot of the platform to things that can be done, mainly on the more software side, of course. The guidelines also need to be part of the civic sector and the government. As Professor Chesterman related to, in the end of the day, there are a lot of ethical questions, what can be done and what not. The system futures, some of them are covered secret, the government can do it by themselves, but some of them is overt. We believe that can be done by academic world, including R&D, and the academic world has a better access to the private sector where the technology can be led. And I believe that in this aspect, at least, of countering terrorism, we need to see more features that come from private sector into the government sector. I believe that my time is ended, so I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Ended indeed. We now have time for a very short time remaining for some questions to our panelists. I invite you all to raise your hands, but we now have an interesting question to begin our discussion from Lim Swee Kim. And that question is addressed to Professor Chesterman. Lim Swee Kim asks, can we regard AI akin to an entity or corporation, as it needs to be registered with an appropriate owner who can then take responsibility for their creation? I think it's a very interesting question, Professor Chesterman.
Sure. Short answer is we could, but should we? So in theory, anyone can create a corporation. In countries like Singapore and Israel, it's very simple. You could create a limited liability corporation. Each vehicle would be its own company. That would be perfectly possible. Why would you want to do that though? Because the only consequence would be that it would limit liability. And so limited liability means you restrict the risk of those who are making investments. We make that bet in the context of corporations. I don't think we need to do it in the context of AI. The second problem with that kind of approach, which is that if you don't create a new company, but you just register every AI system, there are a few cities that are trying this. I think Amsterdam's announced that they're going to register every algorithm that processes public data. The problem is, we all know how prevalent AI is becoming, and it also can change over time. So it would end up being impractical. The concern is that that kind of sort of box ticking approach would end up being like data protection. In 30 seconds, I assume, like me, the vast majority of you on a regular basis have to accept terms and conditions for accessing a website or downloading an app. Put your hand up if you read those terms and conditions. I've published books on data protection law. I don't read those conditions because it's pointless. And so what we're moving in data protection is away from this sort of box ticking approach to a broader accountability approach where the people who deploy and use data have to be held accountable. That's what we've just introduced in Singapore and the GDPR. And I think that's probably where we'll have to go with AI.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Anthony Tao raised their hand, please. You have the floor, sir. Anthony?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Please.
Can you
Loud
hear me?
and clear.
Yes. Ron, you portray what I believe Abba Eban has in terms of diplomacy with aplomb and elan. And that is very important as we interface with artificial intelligence and many other things as we relate to other people. But my question is to Dean Chesterman. On the issue of legal personality, he mentioned AI and River in New Zealand, but he also needs to think about the Lake Erie in the US, north of Ohio. It has been a great place of pollution in the Cuyahoga River, which used to be on fire. And the issue here is, whereas the New Zealand case may not present too many precedents, the US case could, because the Americans tend to be very litigious. Could I have his comments, please?
So again, we could give legal personality. You can give legal personality in India, various Indian temples, and arguably some Indian gods have legal personality. We can give legal personality to anyone we want to give legal personality to, essentially. But should we? And so the Lake Erie case, I don't know the details, but I believe it was in the context of trying to get around questions of standing, which means that the problem with a natural feature, any kind of sort of commons, it's a collective action problem, that if the commons are damaged, who has the ability to sue on behalf of a natural feature? Well, maybe everyone, maybe no one. And legal personality, certainly in New Zealand, certainly in Ecuador, I believe in Lake Erie, was a way of getting around that question. But that's very different from the problem posed by AI. I don't think any of us are particularly worried, at least at the moment, that we need to protect AI from ourselves. That might come, however. At the moment, what we're primarily concerned about is the potential gap when an autonomous vehicle kills someone and it's not clear who it came from, who was responsible, or more realistically, if there's a drone attack and you can't attribute that back to anyone, or a computer virus that spreads through the internet and then causes damage, who can be held accountable? And so the short answer, again, read the article and eventually read the book if you're keen. The short answer is we should prohibit and punish. Prohibit people releasing into the wild uncontrollable or uncontainable AI. And if people violate those norms, then punish them. This is not going to be easy, but I think it's at least a step forward.
Thank you, Professor. If the two ambassadors will indulge us with a few more minutes, if possible, we will give one more person the opportunity to ask their question. Fazlur Rahman bin Kasami, please. Sir, the floor is yours, Fazlur.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, over there, Shalom. Yes, I would like just to address to Daniel. Daniel, thank you for that interesting presentation, especially when you mentioned about this radicalization, and these are individuals, not through organizations. And I would just like to add, I think you may be aware of the report in Singapore last month, where a 20-year-old national serviceman who actually wanted to attempt an attack on the Magen Avraham synagogue. That's something relates to me because Rabbi Mordechai is a very dear friend. It was a shocking news to see that how events that are happening in Middle East, in particular in Jerusalem, has actually influenced some of the Muslims. Now we're talking about here, even in Singapore, to even plan an attack on a synagogue. So you also mentioned that there's a role for the community to play and counter narrative. Maybe if you could maybe share with us beyond on the security apparatus, what more, because as a community leader here also, that we are trying to do more in sending out the message that whatever happens outside Singapore, especially in the Middle East, the conflicts, should not influence any attempt on extremism in Singapore itself. Because one, it doesn't solve the problem in the original place of conflict. And secondly, you're creating another conflict in Singapore. So maybe you could just share with us what more can we do? Thank you.
And thank you. A short answer, please, so we may proceed for conclusion. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Okay. So actually, I gave the example of counter-narrative from the State Department. I will elaborate as an answer a bit more what they did afterwards, after they understood that they need some kind of a reform. What they did, they shut down the center that was responsible for counter-narrative campaigns, and they built a new one, but this time they started to integrate into it data scientists. They did it in collaboration with universities. Also started to work together with civic society and charities that did actually a good work on trying to do their own counter-narrative campaigns. And all together, it progressed into a system that was in some way more proactive, deciding on which will be the target audience, and then try to send campaigns to them. But also what they did, they started to work with for example, in the United States, with the Muslim community themselves. They started, for example, to have hackathons together with clerks and influencers from the community that build their own campaigns, and then together with those data science capabilities, were able to spread it to the target audience. And also they collaborated with tech companies like Google to do so.
Thank you, Daniel. And now, upon conclusion, we move back to our two chairmen for their final remarks before concluding this event. Ambassador Bilhari, please.
Okay, I will be very brief. One point of clarification though. Ron, you said China, you're not sure whether China has aircraft carriers. It has 2 already and is building some more. I think I will conclude by taking up a phrase, I think it was Mr. Afterman who used it, about we not wanting to choose. As I understand that phrase, we do not want to choose, is not a passive approach. In fact, it requires a proactive approach. Proactive approach first to develop a clear and precise idea of your national interests. Secondly, to develop the political consensus, the domestic political consensus to support your definition of national interests. And third, to have the political courage to follow your national interests in whichever direction they may take you. Sometimes they may take you in the direction of China, sometimes they may take you in the direction of the United States, sometimes in the direction of 3rd or 4th countries, or sometimes in the direction that does not particularly please either China or the United States or some 3rd country. But it is always your national interest. And that, I think, is the key to dealing with the complexities of this new era that we are going to be in. I see no need for us to neatly align all our interests in every domain in one direction or another. We should adopt an eclectic approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Bilhari. Ambassador Foussol, please unmute yourself, Ron.
Yes, I said spot on, like always to the point. So in essence, the fact that we're between, a rock and a hard place is obvious. And I agree that the navigation has to be very, very active. It has to be very active to really bring to bear the added value that we have. So, for example, if the United States of America now backed in climate change, the whole issue of water desalination, SDGs, MDGs, a sustainable development, we have an added value, green energy, we can navigate very well. We also can navigate quite well inside the Asian sphere with India, from my point of view, and of course the Gulf, that I think is something that through the Gulf, we can get to other countries that we were not able to reach in the past. bottom line, I think that our flexibility to maneuver is going to be influenced by those two aircraft carriers in the sense, but this is where we have to bring our ingenuity and to make sure that our intelligence is not just artificial, Simon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, now, before we sign off, please join me in thanking all of our speakers and all our guests. And a special vote of thanks goes to Alex and Dalia for arranging this session, and for all our colleagues at the Abba Eban Institute and the Middle East Institute for making today's event a success, a time well spent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And see you in Singapore and Jerusalem, all of you.
Soon enough. Thank you all.